So welcome to our final session on the Continental Reformation. This afternoon you'll be beginning on church history in the 20th century. We're going to look at three areas this morning. First, the period 1530 to 1555, that's between the Diet of Augsburg, with the Augsburg Confession being written, to the Peace of Augsburg. We'll also be thinking a bit about the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent, and then finally some of the impacts of the Reformation on life beyond theology. When we were looking at Luther, we noted that from 1531 onwards his health was failing, so the torch for the Reformation was carried by others. After the protestation at the Imperial Diet at Speyer in 1529, it was clear that the Reformation was bound into German politics. Most of those who protested at the Diet of Speyer were German princes, but the leaders of two Swiss imperial cities were also in their number. Those were the cities of Strasbourg and St. Gallen. So let's have a quick look at Strasbourg and its reformer, Martin Bucer. Martin Bucer was born in Schellstadt in Alsace. This was a free imperial city of the Roman Empire, and he was born in November 1491. In 1507, at the age of 18, he became a Dominican novice and was ordained deacon in Strasbourg in 1510, having become a friar the previous year. He then went on to study in Heidelberg, and there he was influenced by Erasmus and other humanists. He met Martin Luther there in 1518, when Martin Luther came to speak there. And Bucer was convinced by him. He also felt that to be able to explore these ideas he discovered, he needed to be free from the jurisdiction of the Dominicans, and so he sought to have his vows annulled. Eventually this was granted in April 1521. Bucer still needed work, and so he moved to Nuremberg, which was a major imperial city at the time, as chaplain to the Elector Palatine Ludwig V's younger brother Frederick. This put him in a powerful city whose officials were warming to reforming ideas. In 1522, he married the Elizabeth Subaresen, who was a former nun. He went to work as a chaplain in Wiesenberg, and while he was there, he was excommunicated by the bishop on the grounds that his sermons were inciting people to threaten the monasteries. In 1523, he fled to Strasbourg, where, to begin with, he worked as the reformer Zell's unofficial chaplain. 1524, angry mobs broke into the monasteries in Strasbourg after the prior provincial of the Augustinian, Konrad Traeger, denounced reformist preachers and the burghers of Strasbourg as heretics. While they were in the monasteries, they looted and they destroyed religious images. The Council of Strasbourg had to make a decision, and it decided to arrest those who resisted the Reformation, including the aforesaid Traeger. Bucer drafted 12 articles to give the core of the Reformation teaching, including justification by faith, veneration of the saints, or the lack of it, the lack of purgatory, and rejection of papal authority. But they emphasised the submission to civil government. He was also involved in producing a new order of service, in the same way Zwingli had given one to Zurich, and introduced the singing of hymns by the congregation in German into services. In 1526, Bucer published his Apology, which was an effort at unity among the reformers. He argued that different understandings of scriptures were acceptable, but there would be unity as long as everyone had a childlike faith. Clearly they didn't. Bucer tried to resolve the differences between Zwingli and Luther on Holy Communion. In 1528 he published his book conciliation between Dr. Luther and his opponents regarding Christ's supper, arguing that since Luther saw the presence of Christ in the bread as spiritual, rather than the bread really becoming Christ, there really wasn't a distinction. Luther disagreed. And let's introduce you to another of the reformers. This is Philip Melanchthon. His father was an armourer to the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and Philip was born in 1497. The family name was Schwarzschild, which meant black earth. And when he was at school, Philip's humanist great-uncle suggested he adopt a surname in the style of the humanists, in Latin or in Greek. And so he adopted the Greek for dark earth, Melanchthon. Philip studied at Heidelberg and at Tübingen, learning Greek, Latin, astronomy, philosophy, maths, medicine, and then followed this after he got his master's degree by studying theology. And there he followed the humanist course, rejecting scholastic teaching. To pay his way, he lectured in oratory and on Livy and Virgil. Now, due to his reforming ideas, he lost favour at Tübingen, but was invited by Martin Luther to become a professor of Greek at Wittenberg in 1518, when he was just 21. Here he married the mayor's daughter, Katharina Krupp, in 1520, and in 1521 published his first edition of Commonplaces in Theology, or Fundamental Doctrinal Themes. And although this book was based on Romans, it gives the reader an insight into the whole Bible. And Luther was very impressed by it, and so in many ways this became the systematic theology for the Lutheran movement. Melanchthon accompanied the Elector of Saxony to the Diet at Speyer, and so was there when the princes protested. But the House of Habsburg had problems. They really wanted a united Christendom with one hierarchy, because they wanted Charles V and then subsequent emperors to be a universal emperor supported by a universal church. But they also had the Ottoman Turks pressing up into Austria, threatening Vienna and the palace of Duke Ferdinand, who was the younger brother of Charles and was ruling over in Austria and that part of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Habsburgs needed a peaceful empire, and they realised they couldn't forcibly make sure people kept the Edict of Worms, which was telling them they all had to become Roman Catholics, even though it had been backed by the Diet of Speyer. And so in 1530, another diet was called, and among the issues addressed was what to do about the differences in Christendom. Melanchthon was invited by John the Elector of Saxony to put together a statement of faith that was aimed to gain agreement from both Protestants and Catholics. And this is called the Augsburg Confession. Now, this is the founding document of the Lutheran Church. It has 21 articles, and it aimed to show that the views of the Reformers weren't novel, but could be seen as within church tradition. And it's these articles which are then in turn, as part of church tradition, the basis for changes in the forms of worship. The Catholic party examined what had been put forward and then read out a refutation. The Protestant group didn't get a copy of this, but they made notes and came up with their own confutation. At this point, Charles V stepped in. It turned out he really didn't want a compromise. He wanted the Protestants to just give up their protest and accept the authority of Rome. Alongside the Augsburg Confession of the Lutherans, another confession was offered at the Diet, and that was of the four southern German cities of Constance, Lindau, Memmingen and Strasbourg. And it's known as the Tetrapolitan Confession because it represented the four cities, or the Strasbourg Confession, and this was drawn up by Martin Bucer and Wolfgang Capito, who were the reformers in Strasbourg. Now that is the first recognised confession of the Reformed tradition, which would later be dominated by Calvin. So now we're going to think about the Schmalkaldic League and the impact of politics on the Reformation. See, when the emperor was not willing to find a compromise, the Protestant princes started to wonder whether they should still accept his authority. They were also concerned that the Emperor Charles had decided that his brother Ferdinand would be the next emperor, and that emperors after that would always be from the Augsburg, but alternating between Ferdinand's line and Charles's line. But if that's fixed, what's the point of being an elector? Who were you electing if the next emperor was already decided? And so they could see their authority and their power being sapped. So bringing these political concerns together with their religious concerns, Philip of Hesse and John of Saxony launched the Schmalkaldic League. It's named after a town of Schmalkalden in Thuringia. And this was a military alliance for the Protestant princes. The purpose of the League was to provide military resistance to the emperor if he sought to impose the Edict of Worms. Now Luther was initially troubled by this because the Bible says, as far as it's within you, live at peace, and to respect the authorities God has placed over you. But in the end, he wrote his Dr. Martin Luther's warning to his dear German people, in which he argued that it would be a just war to resist the emperor by force if he was trying to impose by force Catholicism, because you'd be defending the gospel against Catholic instigators of the war. It wasn't right to instigate war, but if you were attacked to defend the gospel, you could use force. Now, faced with the Ottoman army on one side and a military alliance on the other, Ferdinand in Austria decided it was best to negotiate peace in Christendom. So in 1532, the Nuremberg standstill was agreed. The Habsburgs wouldn't impose a change back to Catholicism until there'd been a general council of the church to discuss matters. Now, this rest from the threat of war gave the Lutheran preachers a chance to talk to more princes and more people about reforming ideals. More cities joined the League, until it was only the territories ruled directly by the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbach territories which remained Catholic. And these were predominantly in the south of what is now Germany and also to the west. Lutheranism also spread north. Denmark allied with the League in 1538. And although Francis I of France tried to stamp out the Reformation in his own territory, he also formed an alliance with the Schmalkaldic League because they had a common foe, the emperor. Meanwhile, attempts to find a theological reconciliation continued. At the Diet of Regensburg in 1541, a discussion of the Augsburg Confession was to be attempted. Bucer, Melanchthon and Johannes Pistorius represented the Protestant side, with Groper, Pflug and Eck. Remember Eck from his contretemps with Luther, overseen by Cardinal Contarini for the Catholic side. Now this is interesting because Contarini had sympathy with some of Luther's views, but he really wanted any reformation to stay well within the current structures and views of the Church. To begin with, there was agreement. Matters of original sin and free will, absolutely. But matters to do with the sacraments, whether there were 7 or 2, and of course the hierarchy of the Roman Church didn't bring agreement. Then there were the words on justification. These were sent to Luther in Wittenberg and to the papal court for their views. And the Roman party got their response in first, which was only a council of the whole church could address such issues. Luther's reply was that the statements on justification were too ambiguous, but he too would accept the outcome of a council on the issues if it was free and Christian. By this he meant that the Pope had no special authority there and that all arguments could be backed from Scripture. Now he knew the Pope wouldn't accept this, and so it had to be recognised that no reconciliation was to be had. And then we come to 1546 and war. Charles V's war with France ended with the Treaty of Crépy in 1545, and because of that he could turn his military attention to the I'm not very good at pronouncing that one, the Schmalkaldic League. Maurice, who was the Duke and later Elector of Alberta in Saxony, invaded the lands of his rival and stepbrother in Ernenstein, Saxony, John Frederick. Charles V backed Maurice. And Charles V was funded by the papacy. And this was seen as a great opportunity to divide the League and undercut it. And the League's leaders, although they had more troops at their disposal, couldn't agree on their battle plans. And so by the 24th of April 1547, they were failing. And their imperial forces gathered by Charles routed the League's forces at the Battle of Mühlberg. This caused quite a lot of the theologians to flee, including Martin Bucer. He fled to England, where he worked with Cranmer on the 1549 prayer book. In 1548, Charles V forced the League to accept something which is known as the Augsburg Interim. This ordered the Protestants to readopt traditional Catholic beliefs and practices, but did allow those clergy who had married to stay married, and for the laity to continue to receive communion of both kinds. Now, the Pope accepted these concessions to the Protestants in the interim before a general council could be convened, and that's why it's called the Augsburg Interim. But the Catholic princes were unwilling to enforce the interim on their Protestant subjects, and this was because they saw it as the emperor telling them what to do, and they were beginning to see what the Protestant princes had seen as what is the need for an emperor. In 1550, in response to the Augsburg Interim, 9 pastors in Magdeburg produced what's known as the Magdeburg Confession. In this, they refused to accept the imperial law and expressed a willingness to resist using force if need be. The confession argued that when the higher or superior authority makes an unjust or immoral law or decree, the lower or lesser magistrates have both a right and a duty to interpose and refuse obedience to the superior authority, and if needs be, openly resist their unjust or immoral law or decree. Carter Limburg calls this the first Protestant religious justification of the right of defence against unjust higher authorities. You can see how this confession influenced thinkers in France, in the Netherlands, and in England during our Civil War. It also eventually inspired Bonhoeffer when he decided it was right to use force to resist Hitler. 5 months after that confession was issued, Charles V's forces besieged Magdeburg, seeking to reimpose the rule of the Catholic archbishopric. However, by now Maurice of Saxony was disillusioned with Charles and decided he was going to relieve Magdeburg and kick out Charles's forces from his region. He defeated Charles's forces and agreed that people could follow whichever confession they preferred in the city. Meanwhile, the Council of Trent began in 1545, and although it was to continue on or off until 1563, it became clear soon enough that this Council of the Church was to be controlled by the Pope. It was not to be the free and Christian council the reformers had called for. Thus the interim was over because a council had begun, but there was no reconciliation to be had, and the Protestants were going to continue to protest and resist having Roman Catholicism, as we now call it, imposed on them. Maurice, having decided he'd had enough of Charles's forces in his patch, continued his move to become a defender of Lutheranism. He attacked at Charles' army in 1552 at Augsburg, and Charles was forced to withdraw. The Treaty of Passau, and later in 1555 the Treaty of Augsburg, agreed to the principle, he who rules, his the religion, allowing for a certain minimal pluralism that continued in Germany. Different areas could follow Lutheranism or Catholicism, but the whole area would follow it. The peace also included the right of emigration to those unwilling to accept their prince's religion, although they had to settle any debt they had to the prince first, which actually in practice weakened this right. And Castle Lindbergh says, in having to recognise both confessional parties, the emperor lost, at least in theory, the claim to be the second head of Christendom after the Pope.